The Daimler, a stately old thing, rumbled along the narrow lane. Alistair gripped the wheel, perhaps a little too tightly. His sister Eleanor sat beside him, gazing at the passing hedgerows. They were a blur of late spring green. A heavy stillness hung in the air, unusual for May. The sky, a canvas of bruised purple and grey, threatened a storm. Distant thunder rumbled, a low, guttural warning that seemed to vibrate through the very chassis of the motor car. Their journey was one of duty, not pleasure. They travelled to visit the grave of their great-aunt Mildred. Her final resting place was in the cemetery at Blackwood Rest, a village nestled deep within the folds of the Yorkshire Dales. Alistair always found these trips rather morbid. Eleanor, however, felt a certain obligation. The wireless in the car crackled intermittently. Snippets of a news broadcast, something about unexplained disturbances in remote rural areas, were dismissed by Alistair with a wave of his hand. "Static, my dear," he'd said, "or just another BBC scare piece." The sign for Blackwood Rest eventually appeared. It was weathered, the paint peeling, one side hanging precariously. The village itself seemed to shrink away from the road, houses huddled together, their windows like vacant eyes. A sense of unease, subtle yet cloying, began to creep into the car. Eleanor shivered, though the air was not particularly cold. "Almost there," Alistair announced, his voice attempting a cheerfulness it did not possess. The lane narrowed further, the trees overhead forming a dark, oppressive canopy. Blackwood Rest Cemetery was situated on a lonely hill overlooking the village. It was, to put it mildly, rather neglected. Gravestones leaned at odd angles, choked by ivy and weeds. The wind, when it sighed through the ancient yew trees, carried no birdsong, only a mournful, hollow whistle. Alistair parked the Daimler near the rusted wrought-iron gates. He switched off the engine. The ensuing silence was profound, broken only by that distant, ever-present thunder and the creak of the gate as he pushed it open. They located Great-Aunt Mildred's plot without too much difficulty. A simple stone, its inscription faded by time and weather. Alistair produced a small bouquet of funereal lilies. Eleanor bowed her head, a silent prayer on her lips. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken sorrow and something else. A tension, a feeling of being watched. Eleanor glanced around. The cemetery seemed deserted, yet the sensation persisted. A prickling on the back of her neck. It happened with a shocking suddenness. A figure emerged from behind a large, ornate mausoleum. Tall, gaunt, impossibly pale. Its clothes were tattered, its movements jerky, unnatural. Alistair turned, a startled exclamation dying in his throat. The figure lunged, not with the speed of a normal man, but with a terrifying, relentless purpose. There was no sound from it, save a guttural, wet rasp. Eleanor screamed, a raw, primal sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the graveyard. Alistair, brave but unprepared, raised his hands to defend himself. It was a futile gesture. The pale stranger fell upon him. The details were a blur of horror for Eleanor, a sickening thud, a gurgling cry from her brother. She saw him fall, the lilies scattering on the damp earth. The attacker was feeding. Eleanor's mind reeled, refusing to process the grotesque reality. She felt a cold dread seize her, colder than any winter wind. Her legs, however, knew what to do. She turned and fled. Her handbag containing the car keys slipped from her grasp unnoticed. She ran blindly, stumbling over unseen roots and fallen stones. Behind her she could hear a shuffling sound, the rustle of movement through the long grass. It was gaining. She did not dare look back. The cemetery gate seemed miles away, the path to the road an eternity. Panic, cold and sharp, spurred her onward, her breath tearing at her lungs, sobbing for Alistair, for herself. Desperation lent her speed. She burst from the cemetery gates and ran along the lane, away from Blackwood Rest, away from the unspeakable thing that had taken Alistair. The Daimler was out of reach, her mind too fractured to even consider it. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in shades of indigo and blood orange, a faint light flickered in the distance. A farmhouse. Oakhaven Farm, a faded sign proclaimed at the turnoff. Hope, a fragile thing, fluttered within her. The farmhouse stood stark against the darkening horizon. Isolated, silent, perhaps too silent. Eleanor hammered on the heavy oak door. No reply. Only the wind moaning in the eaves like a troubled spirit. The door was unlocked. It creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Hello!" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The interior was gloomy, filled with shadows. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic and decay. She crept inside, every nerve ending screaming. A grandfather clock in the hall stood silent, its hands frozen at 7:15. Upstairs, a floorboard groaned. Her heart pounded. Was someone hiding, or was it merely the old house settling? Gathering her courage, she ascended the creaking staircase. Each step was an agony of suspense. The landing was dark. One door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she saw a sparsely furnished bedroom, and on the bed, a shape. It was the farmer, presumably, or what was left of him. His eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on the ceiling. His throat, it was savagely torn. Blood, dark and congealed, stained the bedding and the floorboards, a scene of utter brutality. Eleanor choked back a cry of horror. This was no sanctuary. This place had already been visited by the same terror she had fled. The silence of the house now felt malevolent, pregnant with unseen threats. She had to get out, but then she heard it, a shuffling sound from downstairs. Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice. The shuffling was closer now in the hallway below. She backed away from the gruesome bedroom, her mind racing. Trapped. There was no escape route from upstairs save the window and a perilous drop. She pressed herself against the wall of the landing, scarcely daring to breathe. The creak of the bottom stair announced an ascent. Slowly, deliberately, a shadow stretched up the stairwell, long and distorted in the faint light filtering through a grimy window. A man appeared, middle-aged, clad in sturdy country tweeds, his face grim. He held a heavy iron poker clutched in his right hand like a club. He moved with caution, his eyes scanning the gloomy landing. When he saw Eleanor, he started, raising the poker defensively. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "What are you doing in this house?" Eleanor, struggling for composure, managed to stammer out her name and a garbled account of the horror in the cemetery. The man listened, his expression unchanging, though his eyes, shrewd and assessing, never left hers. "My name is Finch," he said, finally lowering the poker slightly. "Arthur Finch. I saw them too, in the village, things I can't explain." He gestured vaguely towards the window. "This house belonged to the Cleggs. Seems they met a bad end." He nodded towards the bedroom Eleanor had just fled. "We can't stay here. Not like this." His gaze swept the landing again. There might be something useful. Finch seemed a practical man, despite the terror that must surely grip him. He began a cursory search of the upstairs rooms. In what appeared to be the master bedroom, tucked away in a tall wardrobe, he found an old, double-barreled shotgun. Beside it, a dusty box of cartridges. Not many, but better than nothing. "Well now," Finch muttered, breaking open the gun to check its mechanism. "This might even the odds a little. A small, grim comfort in a world rapidly descending into madness." As Finch checked the shotgun, a faint sound reached their ears, a scraping, then a muffled sob. It seemed to emanate from below, from the direction of the kitchen, perhaps. Finch looked at Eleanor, a silent question in his eyes. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Eleanor nodded, her throat too dry for speech. The house, it seemed, held more secrets than just the unfortunate Mr. Clegg. They descended the stairs cautiously, Finch taking the lead, the shotgun now held at the ready. The sounds led them to a sturdy door at the back of the kitchen, a cellar door bolted from the outside. Finch listened intently, his ear pressed against the wood. More muffled sounds. A child's whimper. "There are people down there," Finch stated, his voice low. "Alive!" He fumbled with the heavy bolt, which slid back with a protesting shriek of metal. He pulled the door open, revealing a flight of steep stone steps leading down into a Stygian blackness. A damp, earthy smell wafted up. "Hello," Finch called down. "Is anyone there? We mean you no harm." A silence. Then a quavering male voice. "Who is it? Are they gone?" Finch explained their presence, his tone attempting reassurance. Slowly, figures emerged from the gloom. A man, his face pale and drawn, named George Gable. His wife, Mary, clutching a small girl tightly. The child, Penelope, perhaps 7 years old, looked terrified. Her eyes were wide and there was a small, angry-looking scratch on her forearm. "We saw them," George Gable whispered, his voice hoarse. "From the window, attacking old man Hemlock in his garden. We ran here, barricaded ourselves in." Mary Gable shivered. "Penelope, she fell trying to get in, scratched herself on a piece of broken fence." She indicated the child's arm. It looked inflamed, but in the dim light it was hard to tell how serious it was. These were the other survivors, frightened, vulnerable, and now their fate was intertwined with Eleanor and Finch. Gun shells. Only a handful remained. "We must conserve ammunition," he stated grimly. "Only fire if they breach the barricades." The siege had truly begun. The long night stretched before them, an abyss of uncertainty and mounting dread. As the hours crawled by, Penelope's condition worsened. Her fever climbed and she became delirious, muttering incoherently. The scratch on her arm now looked grotesquely swollen, the skin around it turning a sickly greyish hue. Mary Gable was frantic. "She needs a doctor! Medicine!" she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. "There must be something in the village or the next town. We can't just let her—" Her voice trailed off, her gaze fixed on her suffering child. A heavy silence filled the besieged kitchen. George Gable, his face a mask of desperation, looked at Finch. "There's an old lorry in the barn," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It might run. If we could reach it, we could try for Allerton. There's a cottage hospital there." Finch considered this. It was a reckless gamble. The barn was 50 yards from the house, across open ground teeming with those things. But Penelope was fading fast. "It's a long shot," Finch said slowly. "A very long shot. But perhaps our only one." The plan was desperate. Finch and George would make a dash for the barn under the cover of a momentary lull in the creature's activity. Eleanor would watch from an upstairs window, the shotgun ready, though its effective range was limited. With hearts pounding, the two men slipped out of the back door. They moved like shadows, flitting from one patch of darkness to another. They reached the barn. The great wooden doors creaked open, then the agonizing sound of an engine refusing to catch, a cough, a sputter, silence, and then the moans, closer. The creatures, drawn by the noise, were converging on the barn. Eleanor saw them from the window, a slow, relentless tide of horror. She shouted a warning. Finch burst from the barn, firing the shotgun twice into the advancing horde. George was right behind him, but he stumbled. A creature, gaunt and horrifyingly fast, lunged from the shadows. George screamed, a short, sharp cry abruptly cut off. Finch, his face contorted in a rictus of fear, barely made it back to the house, slamming and bolting the door, breathing heavily, alone. George Gable's terrible demise shattered the fragile resolve of the remaining survivors. Mary collapsed into incoherent sobs, her grief raw and all-consuming. Finch, pale and breathing heavily from his narrow escape, slumped against the kitchen wall. He had a nasty gash on his arm where one of the creatures had clawed at him as he scrambled back inside. The shotgun was down to its last few shells. Hope, already a flickering ember, seemed to extinguish in the suffocating atmosphere of the farmhouse. The creatures outside, agitated by the gunfire, redoubled their efforts. Suddenly a sickening crack echoed from the living room. A shutter had given way. Panicked, Finch and Eleanor rushed in, just as a grimy hand, its fingernails broken and black, reached through the shattered window pane. Finch fired the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the confined space. The hand recoiled, but more were scrabbling at the opening. In the ensuing chaos, as Finch struggled to reload, another window on the far side of the room shattered. They were breaking in. Mary, lost in her sorrow, was oblivious to the immediate danger, kneeling beside where George had last stood. A creature, its face a grotesque mask of decay, squeezed through the broken frame near Mary. Before Eleanor or Finch could react, it lunged, pulling the still sobbing woman towards the window with terrifying strength. Her scream was abruptly silenced. Finch, perhaps seeing his own end, made a desperate, selfish lunge for the cellar door, shouting, "Every man for himself!" He fumbled with the bolt, abandoning Eleanor to her fate. At that precise moment, young Penelope, who had been unnaturally still, sat bolt upright on the kitchen settle. Her eyes, now milky white, fixed on Eleanor. The child rose, not with the uncertainty of sickness, but with a jerky, predatory grace. A low growl emanated from her small chest. The scratch on her arm was now a festering wound, but she seemed to feel no pain. She was transformed. Penelope launched herself at Eleanor, small hands outstretched like claws, her teeth bared in a silent snarl. Eleanor, horrified and heartbroken, stumbled backwards, deflecting the small, furious attack. She was forced to use the butt of the empty shotgun to push the child away, the thud sickeningly final. Eleanor, her body aching, her mind numb with shock and grief, found herself alone. Finch had presumably made it to the cellar, barricading himself in. The sounds of the undead still echoed through the farmhouse, but they seemed less focused, more dispersed. She retreated to the kitchen, finding a heavy meat cleaver in a drawer, her only weapon now. She dragged a heavy Welsh dresser against the kitchen door, creating a flimsy barricade, and slumped to the floor, utterly exhausted, waiting for the inevitable. The night seemed endless, but then a subtle change. A pearly grey light began to filter through the grimy kitchen window. Dawn. The guttural moans and shuffling sounds outside seemed to diminish, to recede with the darkness. A fragile, almost unbelievable silence descended. Eleanor dared to hope. Hours passed. The silence held. Cautiously, she peered out. The garden was still, littered with debris, but empty of movement. Then she heard it. The distant sound of a vehicle. Voices. Clear, human voices. "Hello, the house. Anyone in there?" A rescue party. Men in rough, improvised uniforms carrying rifles. They found her, a lone, traumatized figure in the ransacked kitchen. Relief, so potent it was painful, washed over Eleanor. They were clearing the house. Their voices calm, professional. As one of the men, a sergeant by his insignia, helped her outside into the pale morning light, he coughed, a dry, racking cough. "Nasty business, this," he said, his own face looking unusually pale. "Seems to be spreading, not just the bites, you know." He gestured vaguely towards the village of Blackwood Rest, now visible in the distance, shrouded in a low-lying, unnatural mist that clung to the ground. "It's in the air here, I reckon. The Blackwood mist, we're calling it. Or maybe the soil itself gets into your lungs. Some of my lads never bitten, they're starting to look peaky." He coughed again, a deeper, more troubling sound. Eleanor looked at the swirling grey vapour coiling around the village, a silent, insidious blight. The horror, she realised with a fresh wave of despair, was far from over. It was merely changing its form.